Hello, 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 and welcome to Radio Free Filler. Yes, we have an unusual show for you tonight. I know all our regular listeners hope that every show will be unusual because they haven't liked the ones we've done so far, but this one is really different. Today we have an appearance from a guest with a new kind of act, Paleontological Stand-up. So let's bring him out now.
Good evening, bipeds. I know a lot of you are probably wondering about my act. You're thinking, how can anyone do stand-up comedy about paleontology? Where would you even start? Well, you certainly wouldn't want to start with the Aeozoic era. No nightlife. Heck, no life at all. Nothing to do but wait around for millions and millions of years for the Earth to cool. That is, unless you're a Bishop Ussher fan. Man, that guy had it all figured out. Now, Bishop Ussher was the one who figured out the exact age of the Earth by using all the lifespans listed in the Old Testament. He came up with the Earth being 4,004 years old. Of course, that was several years ago, and a lot of time has passed since then, but I went back and I checked his math anyway. Turns out that his addition was dead on correct. The man definitely knew how to add. 4,004 years right on the dot. Of course, his calculations were based on the assumption that throughout the entirety of human history, nobody has ever lied about their age. So, yeah, that might be a problem. Of course, in biblical times, they handled ages differently. For example, kids under the age of 30 could ride on the subway for free. Of course, once they got to be 100, they had to pay the adult price to get into a movie theater. The funny thing is, they couldn't get in to see the adult movies until they were 150. I bet a lot of people wondered about that. At least, they wondered for about 50 years, and after that, they were allowed in and they didn't care anymore. The personal ads must have looked a little different, too. You know, open-minded widower, age 500 but only looks 350, seeks like-minded concubine. I don't think Bishop Ussher dealt with those parts, though. I sure would have liked to have his sports car, though. I mean, he could take a trip that would take anyone else 5 billion years and clock in at only 4,004 years. He would have been great for cross-continental hitchhikers. Here's a guy standing on a street corner in New York City with his thumb out. Where are you headed? L.A. Hop in. Okay, have a nice day. Either that or he knew about some kind of shortcut. Now, some of you are probably wondering what Bishop Ussher is doing in an act that's supposed to be a paleontological stand-up routine. Well, the answer's easy. There are always a few creationists in the audience, and they believe that they're scientists too. I like to include all types of people when I perform. You could say that my act is intelligently designed that way. Now, for the rest of you, you know, the patient ones who don't mind waiting a few 100 million years, I like to start with the Cambrian period, right at the beginning of the Paleozoic era. That's when things really got going, you know? Oh, sure, you had a lot of earlier life forms, but they were all slimy and gooey and stuff. If you got mad at one and told him to just dry up, he might actually do it. It was socially awkward as well. I mean, when a paramecium said he was going to split, you didn't know whether he was leaving or reproducing. So yeah, give me the Cambrian period. You know, the name actually comes from the Latin word referring to whales. That's whales the place, not whales the sea creatures. Anyway, if you go into a bar and you mention the Cambrian period, the bartender will either start talking about trilobites or stop serving you. The Cambrian period did have a lot of trilobites. Some people say that arthropods were actually the dominant life form at the time, but I don't know how to prove it. They reckon that the trilobites left sturdier fossils, but there were more arthropods, so that made the arthropods the dominant ones. Well, I reckon there are more employees than there are bosses, too, but we all know which one of those two groups is the dominant one. Anyway, next up, you got the Ordovician period. That's Ordovician, not Ordovician. But I don't know why. It's named after the Ordovices, which was a Welsh tribe. Maybe it's because they didn't have devices back then. Just fishes. Some of the fishes were developing jaws, too. Still a lot of trilobites, though. After that came the Silurian period. It was named after another Welsh tribe, the Silures, which, as much as I hate to say it, would have been a good name for an oldies rock band. I know that kind of joke is long since extinct, but as it turns out, the Silurian period itself was known for a mass extinction. Some 60% of marine animals were wiped out, but some of the trilobites still survived and the fishes were starting to come on strong. The Silurian period was relatively short, and so is this bit. Next up, we have the Devonian period, which is sometimes called the Age of Fishes. By the way, it's named after Devon, England, but at least we're done with all that tribal stuff. Maybe it was called the Age of Fishes because there wasn't that much happening on land yet. A few plants made the transition, and that gave some of the arthropods something to try to nibble on. But most of the action was in the water. By the way, some of those arthropods were evolving into spiders, so there you are. The Carboniferous period followed, and that was all about trees. At least that's how they arrived at the name. The trees got going, and then they died, and then they fell down, and then they turned into coal with lots of carbon-type fossils, and the scientists got a nice functional name that everyone could live with. In the 19th century, when the names were being handed out, coal was still a big business as well. Amphibians finally got going on land, but it was a bad time to be a trilobite. A few of them tried crawling out onto land, but it wasn't really their thing because they didn't like the food. Also, with all those flashy amphibians going around, it was probably hard for a trilobite to even get noticed, let alone get a date. Winding up the Paleozoic era was the Permian period, which meant curtains for the trilobites. The name came from the region of Perm in Russia, so we're back to the local nomenclature thing again. Maybe they had a really strong chamber of commerce. Anyway, there were no hairstyles during the Paleozoic era, so you can just forget about any of those perm jokes you were going to make. Oh, there was another mass extinction, even worse than before. It wiped out more than 90% of marine life and about 70% of land life as well. Who survived? Well, reptiles for one, and cockroaches. And they call this evolution. Now it's time for the Mesozoic era, and all the kids out there know that means dinosaurs. But you gotta wait for it, because the Triassic period comes first, and it's kinda quiet. By the way, there is no truth to the rumor that the Triassic period was named after a man with 3 buttocks. In fact, there isn't even any such rumor. I just put it in for a cheap laugh. For those of you out there who are counting, we're up to the range of 200 to 250 million years ago, or for you Bishop Usher fans, somewhere around Friday. It's hard to be too sure because they've started fiddling with the calendars after that. Now hardly anybody even knows for sure what day George Washington was born, and he's not around to ask. So anyway, the Triassic. Now you gotta remember that the Earth had been a major mess all this time, and nothing was where you thought it should be. The continents were drifting, sometimes splitting, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, or maybe the ocean levels were making it look that way. And for most of the Triassic, you had the supercontinent known as Pangaea. And you could walk from New Jersey to Morocco because it was just next door. With such a big continent, you had a huge internal landmass, and things got pretty hot and dry. Still, the remaining life forms got busy. and the first mammals even evolved by the end of the period. They were pretty teeny, though, and mostly lived on insects. Now, before we go any further, I've got to say a few things about mammals. Mammals have been trading for 200 million years on a gimmick. I mean, think about it. It's even built into their name. Now, it's not the live birth thing. Not all the other animals laid eggs, you know. It's not even the warm blood. No, it's the fact that, as your grade school teacher probably euphemistically put it, mammals nurse their young. Well, I'm here to explode that myth. The truth is that only a little more than half of those creatures we call mammals nurse their young. That's because the nursing is only done by the female of the species, right on up to and including humans. By that definition, nobody's dad is a mammal. Now, your mom might find this to be the answer to some long-held doubts, like, I knew there was something suspicious about that guy when I married him. So much for mammals. Anyway, the reptiles were doing their best to become bigger and more interesting, not just to paleontologists. Getting bigger and more interesting comes in handy when you're trying to attract a mate or scare off a would-be predator. It's even better when you are a would-be predator. So grow your spikes, grow your spines, grow your armor, get your pointy teeth. It'll help you get ready for the Jurassic period. Now, the name of the Jurassic period has nothing to do with the Scopes monkey trial of 1925, and neither should you. Its name comes from the Jura Mountains in the European Alps, and they were actually pretty close to where you'd expect them to be by then. A map of the period shows either a lot more water or a lot less land, and it made it an easier time to live, especially if you were a reptile. You could be a plesiosaur if you liked the water, or a pterosaur if you liked the air, and there was plenty of comfortable land around as well. Some of the big name dinosaurs got going during that period: Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, Diplodocus, to name a few. However, one of the biggest names didn't come until much later. Pachycephalosaurus was actually a late Cretaceous creature, and he wasn't all that important, he just had a really big name. The Cretaceous period was the beginning of the end for the Mesozoic era. Actually, the beginning of the Cretaceous was the beginning of the end, and the end of the Cretaceous was the end of the end. However, everyone had nearly 80 million years to get used to the idea. Now, the name Cretaceous comes from the German word for chalk, which can't have been much fun to live in. For instance, the evening weather report probably went something like this. Well, the outlook for tomorrow is pretty much Cretaceous. In fact, it's expected to be Cretaceous right on up through the weekend and into next week. And there's a slight chance of meteors, so you might want to bring along a light jacket. Let's face it, the forecasting of the day must have been pretty primitive at best. Meanwhile, the continent of South America was separating from the continent of Africa, and the custody situation can't have looked good. Tyrannosaurus Rex showed up, and he was pretty ticked off by the complete absence of any stegosauruses to fight with. He had to settle for Triceratops for combat sports. Much is made of the supposedly small arms of a Tyrannosaurus, but they could actually be as long as 3 feet. That's a little longer than the average human arm, so you wouldn't want to spar with a Tyrannosaurus, even with protective headgear. Their large physical size just made their arms look small by comparison, just as their arms probably made their butts look big. Some things just can't be helped. Before we leave the Cretaceous, I'd like to say a few words about the whole Ankylosaurus idea. It seems that the armored body offensive tail weapon is a recurring theme throughout the evolutionary process. Stegosaurus kind of tried it during the Jurassic with the spiky tail, but the plates on its back were they were just fabulous, not so effective as armor. Then you had Ankylosaurus in the Cretaceous with better armor and a clubbed tail. But watch this space. In another 60 million years, that idea will be ripe for a comeback. And then it ended. The Cretaceous period, the Mesozoic era, the Age of Reptiles, the whole shebang just ended, and things were never quite the same after that. Now came mammal time. One thing I noticed about mammal time is that the time divisions got shorter. All of a sudden they started dividing the periods into epochs. In the age of mammals, you had the Tertiary period and the Quaternary period, but in the Tertiary period, you had all these little short epochs, the Paleocene, the Eocene, the Oligocene, the Miocene, and the Pliocene. The Quaternary period just got the Pleistocene, or Ice Age, and what some folks are calling the Holocene, either recent or the Age of Man. However, with all that, it's only a span of about 66 million years. I think it might be based on the way gas pumps worked, where the numbers went flying by until you got near the end and then they crawled. I'm not sure they still do that even. I should pay more attention. What most people will remember about the Paleocene is hardly anything, but they know that the Eocene had the little horses called Eohippus. The Eocene also had the Uintatherium, but it didn't make for good bar conversation. That would go something like, Uintatherium? No, I'm into sushi. Check, please. I'm not sure it really went that way because I don't go to bars. I'm afraid of ending up in someone else's joke. After the Eocene came the Oligocene, but there was no Oligohippus, so forget it. Well, they did have the Titanotheres, which seemed to be the mammalian answer to the Triceratops. These things come and go, you see. Somewhere between the Oligocene and the Miocene, a rhinoceros evolved into a Baluchitherium, became self-conscious about its sheer size, and dropped dead. At least that's what the fossil record suggests. Meanwhile, the horses were getting bigger, but losing toes, Merychippus style. By the way, there was a Myohippus, but it lived before the Miocene. Somebody should really look into that. Now, the Pliocene was beginning to look pretty ordinary by modern standards. The horses were horsier, dogs and bears were becoming defined, and so were pigs. Occasionally you'd get something off the wall like the American mastodon, but after all, it was only about 5 million years ago, and all the continents were pretty well lined up. Now, there must have been something funny about the Pleistocene, or so-called Ice Age, because of the wealth of cartoons set in that period. But since everyone knows about those, I'll leave it alone. Paleontologically speaking, everything was a little hairier, like the mammoths and the rhinoceroses, or toothier, like Smilodon. And then you had the Glyptodon. Remember when I mentioned the armored body tail weapon thing? Well, the tail of the Glyptodon wasn't much, but it was covered in scales, and the body armor made for a quite substantial shell. There is some question as to whether their extinction was the result of human predation, but remember, it's humans who are making the judgment calls. Anyway, that brings us up to the present boring day, so I'm going to shift gears now and introduce you to some new talent. Yes, I'm not just a stand-up guy, I'm also an agent. And here is my latest discovery. None other than Eryops, the prehistoric amphibian.
So, what's his act?
He can say his own name.
That's it?
And he's over 250 million years old.
Actually, that's pretty impressive. I might not even remember my name by the time I reach that age. Can you have him demonstrate?
I'll try. Okay now, do your thing. Come on, the people are waiting.
Maybe this isn't the time.
No, I can tell. He's getting wound up.
Wow!
Okay, now do it again.
So, where does he go from here?
We're getting him his own show. Here's the intro.
It's Eryops,
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 the Permian amphibian who says his own name. It's Eryops,
Eryops,
Eryops.
Eryops.
We love the way he says his own name.
I like the jingle, but do you think you can get a whole show out of that?
Sure, we'll just put him in a lot of different situations. What you call a good old-fashioned situation comedy. For example, we'll have him make an appearance on a TV game show.
What show would have him?
The Carbon Dating Game.
And what else?
Name that tune.
But all he can say is his own name.
I didn't say he'd win, just that he'd be on the show. Remember the first rule of old-fashioned situation comedy. Always return to the status quo.
And I think it's time for us to return to the other programming on this station. So long for now from Radio Free Filler.
It's Eryops.
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 The Permian amphibian who says his own name. It's Eryops.
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 We love the way he says his own name.